Today we'll be looking at a case from the mid-20th century. So sit back as we go to the USA. Alcaloo started as a small community in South Carolina, some 90 miles from Charleston, and by 1890 had established itself as a mill town. Many people who lived there did so in company housing, while employed at the Alcaloo lumber mill. As the years passed, the business expanded, and Alcaloo welcomed additional mills into the town. They introduced a hotel, a company store, and several schools and churches. By 1940, a few thousand people called Alcaloo home. One such family was the Stinneys. Father George Sr. worked at the town sawmill, a job that allowed him and his family to rent a modest company-owned house, to the side of which was a chicken coop, and at the back was the family's solitary cow that the children were responsible for caring for. George Sr. and his wife had 4 children together. George Jr. was the eldest. Then came Charles, followed by Catherine, and the youngest was called Emmy. Mr. and Mrs. Stinney were strict, hard-working parents who raised their children to be responsible and diligent. Everyone was expected to contribute to keeping the home clean and the animals cared for. And although George Sr. did not earn very much money, he always made sure that his children had everything they needed. Typical of many small southern towns at the time, black and white residents lived very different existences. The train tracks that ran through Alcaloo formed a dividing line between the two parts. In the 1940s, the Jim Crow laws were still in effect in South Carolina, which legalized segregation. The Stinney children attended a segregated school, and George Sr. made it clear to them that they were not to cross the tracks, something they took seriously and didn't seek to defy. On Sundays, the family would make their way to the Green Hill Baptist Church, which was located nearby. The weekly routine was a cherished tradition, as church was not only a place for worship, but also a vital social and cultural centre for the black community. As there was so much racial segregation and discrimination, the church was able to provide a sense of belonging, support and unity. It was somewhere where families could gather, share their experiences, and find solace in their faith, away from the harsh realities of life. For George and his family, these Sunday services were like a source of strength and community, helping them to maintain their faith and dignity in the face of the very difficult circumstances they faced. Friday the 24th of March 1944 began like any other day in Alcaloo. The weather was mild and pleasant, with the sun shining brightly overhead. Spring was in full swing, and the first blooms of the season dotted the landscape. The town was surrounded by lush greenery, creating a peaceful and refreshing atmosphere. 14-year-old George Jr. and his 7-year-old sister Emmy had finished their day at school and were tackling their daily chores. Top of their list was taking the family cow out to graze just in front of their house. It was a simple routine task for them, one they did very regularly. Meanwhile, not too far away, 2 other children had set off from their homes after finishing their own school day. Unlike George Jr. and Emmy, chores weren't on their agenda. 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames had their sights set on a carefree afternoon of adventure, determined to track down some maypops, bright fragrant fruits of the purple passion flower, which grew wild along the edges of the train tracks. The girls had one bicycle between them and took turns in riding it. Their laughter echoed in the warm breeze, but their hunt for the elusive maypops had stretched longer than expected. As time passed with no maypops, they neared the train tracks, where they spotted 2 children in the distance, a boy and a girl who stood watching over a lone cow grazing in the field. Without a second thought, the 2 young girls crossed the train tracks and went up to the children to ask them if they knew where they could find any maypops. George and Emmy, probably wanting to keep the conversation brief, simply replied that they did not. Then they went their separate ways, with Betty June and Mary Emma leaving in high spirits, while George and Emmy finished grazing the cow and went back to their house just as the sun was setting. That evening, while at a neighbour's house, the family received news that had been steadily spreading across Alcaloo. 2 young girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, hadn't returned home that evening, and people were out looking for them. George Jr. looked over to his father and mentioned that he and Emmy had seen the girls that afternoon. He described the interaction, and George Sr. thought it might be useful in the search. Going exploring was a common pastime for young Alcaloo residents, but the girls knew what time they needed to be home, and when they failed to return, panic set in, and a search was launched. Townspeople, police officers, and volunteers scoured the woods, fields, and nearby swamps, retracing the girls' possible steps. As darkness fell, lanterns and flashlights lit up the rural landscape, casting eerie shadows over the search efforts. The quiet town, where nothing much ever seemed to happen, was suddenly plunged into fear and uncertainty. Hope was still high as the sun rose on the Saturday morning. Surely the girls would turn up with a strange but harmless story of what had happened. Maybe they had simply got lost in a part of the woods they weren't familiar with, unable to find their way back before dark. However, at around 7 a.m, a group of men who were searching on the side of town that was occupied by the black residents made a grim discovery. One of them had noticed faint footprints, small and delicate in the soft muddy ground. Footprints that undoubtedly belonged to a child. The men had then pressed on, scanning the area more carefully. One of them found a pair of scissors in the dirt, and they were aware that Betty June had carried scissors with her in order to cut the maypops. As they moved deeper into a neglected patch of land near a waterlogged ditch, something else caught their eye. A bicycle, barely visible beneath the tangled bush. A closer look revealed that the bicycle wasn't the only thing in the water. Lying on their backs were two girls, who the men instantly realised must have been the missing children, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. One of the men jumped down into the ditch, praying against all odds that the girls were still alive. But as soon as his hand touched the cold skin of the first girl, that hope was shattered. They were both dead. Their small bodies bore the signs of brutal violence, their heads marked by severe trauma inflicted by a blunt object. Their bodies were taken to Dr. Ashbury Cecil Bozard so he could perform an examination. After completing his assessment, the tragic circumstances surrounding the girls' deaths came to light. Mary Emma had a jagged cut above her eyebrow, alongside a significant head injury that had ultimately led to her demise. In Betty June's case, the focus of the attack had been on the back of her head, where she had sustained multiple blows. Dr. Bozard noted that it was a level of trauma that he had never encountered before. Back at the Stinneys' home, George Jr. and his older half-brother Johnny were spending time together before Johnny had to go off to report for military duty. In the front yard, Emmy kept herself entertained with a young batch of chicks that had recently hatched. Her brother Charles and sister Catherine were away, as were their parents, but this was a good way to pass the time. So focused on what she was doing, Emmy didn't notice the two cars cruising down the streets. Before she knew it, they had pulled up beside her house, and a group of white men exited. They were dressed in uniform and seemed to know exactly who they were looking for. They walked right into the Stinney home through the back door. Emmy knew something very bad was happening, so she rushed into the chicken coop, cowering amongst the hens. She watched as the men emerged with her brothers, George and Johnny, both in handcuffs. She then saw as George Jr. was loaded into one of the cars and Johnny into the other. The situation escalated rapidly. Mr. George Stinney Sr. was fired from his job at the local sawmill, and as rumours of a lynch mob began circulating, he and his wife decided to leave town with their 3 other children, seeking refuge at a relative's home in Pinewoods, about 20 miles from Alcaloo. Mrs. Stinney wept throughout the journey. Later that evening, Johnny was released and then left on the side of the highway to find his way home. Meanwhile, George was interrogated alone, with no family or legal representation. Clarendon Deputy Sheriff H.S. Newman and Governor's Office Representative S.J. Pratt grilled him while other law enforcement officers searched for Stinney's home for evidence. They found nothing, but after an hour of interrogating George, Sheriff Newman emerged, claiming that the boy had confessed to the double murder. However, he had no way to back this up, not even so much as a transcript of the alleged confession. Even though there was no actual proof, nor any evidence tying him to the crime, 14-year-old George Stinney was kept in custody while the sheriff's office organised a coroner's inquest. The inquest was held on the 29th of March and reflected the same inconsistencies that had been used since the arrest. A man named Mr. George Burke, who was in the group that had found the girls, served as a jury foreman. This was very strange, as he should only have been called as a witness at a possible trial, but certainly not given the role of jury foreman. The inquest did not last long, and the jury swiftly recommended that the prosecutor proceed with sending the charges against George Stinney to a grand jury. Bizarrely, George Burke yet again was involved, this time serving on the grand jury itself. Before the trial, George's mother was allowed a brief visit with him. During their emotional meeting, the young boy tearfully admitted how terrified he was, insisting he hadn't committed the crime he was accused of. But the legal process moved quickly. A special request to expedite the trial was granted, and shortly afterwards, the jury selection was completed. Just 31 days after his arrest, 14-year-old George Stinney found himself in court seated before the judge at the Clarendon County Courthouse. He was totally alone, with no family or supporters by his side. George was represented by a court-appointed attorney named Charles Plowden. However, Mr. Plowden wasn't a criminal defence attorney. He was actually a tax commissioner with political aspirations, hoping to secure election to local office. The prosecution's presentation of the case was brief. In addition to the testimony of 3 police officers, they called only 3 other witnesses. Reverend Francis Batson, who had discovered the girls' bodies. The prosecution also presented 2 conflicting versions of George's supposed confession. In one, they said that George had claimed that the girls attacked him after he had tried to help one of them out of a ditch, and this led him to kill them in self-defence. In the other version, he supposedly confessed to following the girls, attacking Mary Emma first, and then turning his attention to Betty June. However, when it was Mr. Plowden's turn to present a defence, he made no effort to do so. He didn't contest the validity of George's alleged confession, question the lack of evidence, or address the rushed proceedings and the police's failure to investigate other possible suspects. Instead, Mr. Plowden remained silent and called no witnesses, not even George's little sister, who could have offered an alibi for his whereabouts during the murders. In fact, Emmy had never even been questioned by the detectives. The entire trial lasted for just 2.5 hours, and when the all-white jury was sent out to deliberate, they did so for less than 10 minutes before returning with a verdict. George Stinney Jr. was found guilty of the murders of Betty June and Mary Emma. Judge Philip H. Stoll then sentenced him to death by the electric chair. George's family tried to appeal to the governor, Olin D. Johnson, for clemency, but they were unsuccessful. Various churches and the NAACP also lodged appeals. Campaigners pointed out that just a month earlier, a 16-year-old white boy from Paris Island in South Carolina named Ernest Edmund Feltwell had pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. In the US District Court, he was charged with a murder that took place in December 1943 of an 8-year-old girl in South Carolina's capital city of Columbia. During his trial, he claimed that the killing was accidental and that he had no intention of taking the girl's life. The prosecution had alleged that the boy had murdered the young girl while attempting to assault her. Just prior to entering his plea, Ernest Feltwell signed a confession in the presence of his court-appointed attorneys. Originally, he'd entered a not guilty plea, but his defence team informed the court of his decision to change his plea to guilty for second-degree murder. On sentencing, Judge J. Waits Waring handed him a 20-year prison term. He then explained that modern institutions aimed at rehabilitation, assuring the boy that he wouldn't be placed with hardened criminals, and that he would have the opportunity to learn a trade. Judge Waring also mentioned that Ernest Feltwell could be eligible for parole after serving a third of his sentence, providing his conduct justified it. Of course, this was very different to the treatment of young George Stinney. All the appeals were denied, and George's parents were allowed just one visit before his execution. At 7:30 a.m. on Friday the 16th of June 1944, less than 4 months after the crime occurred, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was executed. It was every bit as horrific as you might imagine. George was small for his age and didn't fit properly in the electric chair. To try to alter this, a Bible was used to prop him up on the seat. He then had his arms and legs and body strapped in, and when asked if he had any last words, George politely replied, "No, sir." A strap was placed over his mouth, and a tear began to flow. The mask was then put over his face, despite it being far too large. Following his execution, 14-year-old George Stinney was buried in an unmarked grave at the Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery in Lee County. The execution made national headlines and sparked widespread outrage, but nothing ever came of it. As time went on, public attention shifted to other events and news, and with many US servicemen fighting in World War II, the newspapers and the public moved on to other stories. This left the case of George Stinney Jr. largely forgotten, and for decades his family remained silent and out of the spotlight. George Sr. died in 1965 at the age of 63, while Mrs. Stinney passed away in 1989, having lived into her 80s. On the 50th anniversary of her brother's execution, one of George Stinney Jr.'s sisters, named Catherine, did an interview in which she revealed that he had written to the family while in prison, reassuring them that he was innocent, something that none of them had ever doubted. In 2013, the family felt that it was time to take legal action. They sought to have the case re-examined and argue that George had not received a fair trial, that his confession had been coerced, and there was not enough evidence to convict him. The case was picked up by South Carolina attorneys Steve McKenzie and Matt Burgess, who filed a motion for a new trial with Clarendon County. The motion was granted, and a hearing was held, where all the evidence was presented. George's sister Emmy was finally able to speak as a witness on her brother's behalf. In December 2014, Circuit Court Judge Carmen Mullen overturned George Stinney Jr.'s conviction and ruled that his constitutional right to a fair trial had been violated. This ruling wasn't making a statement on George's innocence, but it did overturn his conviction, noting the seriously flawed original trial. It was a symbolic ruling. It wasn't something that could undo the harm done all those years ago, but it was a way for George's surviving family to finally close this chapter and start to heal old wounds. However, while relatives of George Stinney and civil rights supporters welcomed the overturning of his conviction, relatives of Betty Binnicker and Mary Thames were disappointed. They remained convinced of the young man's guilt, despite the controversy over his execution at just 14 years old. Betty Binnicker's niece claimed that her family had thoroughly researched the case and criticised the public for not knowing the full truth. She also mentioned a police officer who told her never to doubt George Stinney's guilt. Another relative acknowledged the trial was unfair and that the young boy shouldn't have been executed, but still believed he was guilty. Since George's execution on Friday the 16th of June 1944, there have been claims of other potential suspects in the case. These include an alleged deathbed confession by a member of a prominent family. However, no such confession has ever been officially acknowledged, and no other suspects have ever been properly investigated. In 2014, a memorial to George Stinney was erected in Alcaloo. It reads, "Wrongly convicted, illegally executed by South Carolina, conviction vacated by court order." Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.